Welcome to Light Over Heat with Professor David Yamani. This week I have an excerpt from the seventh and final webinar of my 10 Essential Observations on Guns in America series. It's been a great pleasure to present this webinar series to over 500 people. If you didn't have a chance to catch the webinar, it's too late to get the streaming videos, but I'm going to put the full videos out on my YouTube channel right here over the course of 7 weeks in the summertime. So stay tuned for that. It's a great reason to subscribe to this channel so you know when those videos come out. I'm grateful for everybody who dedicated some of their busy lives to partaking in this webinar, either live or via streaming download. If I've brought some value to you in presenting this webinar series, please share it with someone you think might be interested. Like the videos, subscribe to the channel. This helps me to get outside of my carefully curated bubble of people that I'm already in contact with. I'd really like to bring this message to a much broader audience, and only you can help me do that. All right, guns do not possess a teleology. So some of you may not know what teleology is. It comes from the Greek word telos, which means the end. And so teleology is the end or purpose of some object or phenomenon. So if we talk about the teleology of a gun, we're talking about the purpose for which the gun exists, right? And Wright rejects this idea of teleology, I think, in part. And here we probably need a little bit of clarification. So Wright says, any firearm is neither more nor less than a chunk of machined metal that can be put to a variety of purposes, all involving a small projectile hurtling at high velocity downrange to lodge itself in a target. So here he's, basically saying that, guns don't have a particular purpose, except perhaps to hurl a projectile at high velocity at a target. So he says, by definition, all guns are designed to kill, that is, to throw a projectile downrange to lodge in a target. Trying to sort firearms into inherently bad and inherently good categories seems fundamentally silly, right? So, he's rejecting the idea that guns have a teleology in the sense that the purpose of guns are good or bad, right? The purpose of guns are to hurl projectiles at whatever we're trying to make that projectile impact. So here, again, we see some other folks kind of jumping in with some, clarification to say that, maybe guns do have a teleology in the sense of the purpose of guns, according to political scientist Tim Luke, is to shoot, right? That is what guns are designed to do. If they have a teleology, that is what it is. But this is a very different teleology than what many people who are on the gun skeptic side, who think of the purpose of guns being to kill, right? So the purpose of guns is not to kill. That's not the teleology of guns, although they can be put to that purpose, both for good and for ill. And again, also Evan Selinger. Luke and Selinger are both readings that are available in the course materials if you wanted to follow up, or if you're wondering where I'm getting this material from. So Evan Selinger talks about a gun's mechanisms were built for the purpose of releasing deadly projectiles outward, right? And here, we could probably bracket the deadly and just say the purpose of releasing projectiles outward. For the most part, a gun's excellence simply lies in its capacity to quickly fire bullets. And here, again, we can bracket quickly because it's really its capacity to fire bullets that can reliably pierce or impact targets, right? Again, this is, if we take out some of those words, a fairly neutral description of the purpose, the end, or the teleology of a gun, right? And this is, again, both different from its purpose being to kill, but also, Selinger makes the point that using the butt of a gun to hammer the nail into a wanted poster, gun can be used for that, but that is not a gun's purpose. That's an ancillary use of a gun. So again, Wright is rejecting the teleology of a gun in the sense of being inherently good or bad. But, we can recognize that guns do have a particular purpose. They're designed to do a particular thing, but that particular thing that guns are designed to do is neutral, right? And because the purpose that guns are designed for is morally neutral, we get what I call a paradox of guns, right? That guns can be used for multiple and contradictory purposes, within what they are designed for. So here, let me just read a section from the conclusion, the introduction to the conclusion of my book, really, where I kind of try to articulate this idea of the paradox of guns. And I say, if there is a single overarching lesson I've learned in my search for the truth about American gun culture, it is the importance of understanding that guns are not one thing, but many, and paradoxical at that. They are fun and frightening, dangerous and protective, diffuse and concentrated, unifying and divisive, attractive and repulsive, interesting and controversial, useful and useless, good and bad, and neither good nor bad. That is to say, guns are not inherently anything. They take on different meanings according to the various purposes to which people put them. This is the paradoxical nature of guns. And I actually talk about this with respect to a particular type of gun in chapter 4 on the AR-15 and the question of whether AR-15s are properly understood as a weapon of war. So I say there's nothing inherent in any of these widely owned rifles, AR-15s, that make them weapons of war. A rifle in the hands of a civilian harvesting game is a hunting rifle. The same weapon in a competitive shooter's hands is a sporting rifle. The same rifle in the hands of a civilian defending herself is a defensive firearm. In the hands of a mass shooter, it is a murder weapon. And in the hands of a soldier in battle, it is a weapon of war. Of course, for those people who primarily associate AR-15s with the latter two categories of use, mass shooters and soldiers, it is easy to think of them essentially as weapons of war, right? So again, here I think sort of along the lines of Wright's argument that guns don't have a teleology, the AR-15 doesn't have a teleology other than to propel projectiles down range at whatever the rifle is being pointed at, but the meaning of the rifle is in its use. So does that mean that guns are just tools, right? This is something that I certainly hear quite a lot within the gun culture as a kind of defense, one of these things saying, that firearms don't have a particular purpose. They don't have a particular positive or negative teleology. They're just a tool, right? Something to hurl projectiles. And I'm just noticing in this picture, I apologize to those of you who are being triggered by my open dust cover there. I'm not a rifle guy, so I'm just noticing it now. Maybe I'll go back and edit this and replace that photo with another one. In any event, Sandy and I at the NRA meeting were sitting at the bar at the Omni Hotel, and we met this guy, Ring of Freedom NRA member, which means he's a big donor. He was there, super excited to see Donald Trump speak. And I introduced myself to him. I was telling him about my book. I said it's about the process by which I became a gun owner. And his response as a multi-generational Texas rancher was, that he always finds it weird when people characterize themselves as gun owners, because although he owns guns, he doesn't think of being a gun owner as at all part of his identity, because, as he said, Guns are just tools. They're just like forks. Okay. So I understand why people talk about guns as just being tools, right? This has to do, with that idea that they don't have a positive or negative teleology, that the meaning of gun is in its use. If you use it simply as a tool, then that's all it is. At the same time, don't ever bring a fork to a gunfight. Okay. So, guns are tools, but they are not just any tools, right? Here we get back to that other understanding of teleology. They are purpose designed to hurl projectiles at whatever they're being pointed at high speeds, right? So, as the folks at Open Source Defense say, guns are dangerous, right? Guns are inherently dangerous tools, and that's a feature, not a bug, right? The point isn't to try to make guns less dangerous. If you do make a gun less dangerous, then you're actually sort of getting at undermining their teleology, right? We have to accept that this is part of what guns are and what guns do, and especially if you are a hunter, right, or if you are a defensive gun owner, right? These are deadly weapons, as Tom Gibbons says. If they weren't, they wouldn't be useful to us at all, right? And so, there are many tools that can be dangerous. I've had, on my YouTube channel talking about this issue and talking about chainsaws, the danger of chainsaws and other tools. But in my view, a fork can be used as a weapon, but it is not as effective a weapon as a gun is, because that is not in the fork's teleology. So this really raises the question of what is called in the scholarly literature firearms instrumentality, right? According to the authors of this book, crime is not the problem, lethal violence in America. When we compare the United States to other industrialized nations, in most categories of nonviolent crime, burglary, theft, and other property offenses, American crime rates are comparable or even lower in some cases than the crime rates in other countries. So this general trend holds true when we even compare cities of roughly the same size in different countries, right? So this is why they're saying the problem in the United States isn't crime. Our crime rates and arguably even our violent crime rates are similar to other advanced industrialized countries. The problem is the lethality of the violence that we have in this country. So only when it comes to lethal violence does the United States outpace other Western nations, with homicide rates many, many times greater, right? So that disjuncture between nonviolent crime rates, violent crime rates, and homicidal crime rates or homicide rates, that's where the U.S. really stands out, and they attribute this to firearms instrumentality, right? We have so many more firearms in the United States than in these other countries, and that guns make violent situations more lethal, right? And, it's worth pointing out, this is just kind of an aside, right, that, guns are actually involved in a very small proportion of crimes. The aggregate numbers are still, pretty staggering, right? So 38,000 rapes or sexual assaults were committed with a firearm, but that's only 5% of all rapes and sexual assaults. Similarly, aggravated assault with injury, only 42,000 of 353,000 of those crimes were committed with a gun, right? So, guns are a very small portion of all of the violence and other crimes that are committed in the United States. But when guns are used, they turn these situations into lethal ones, right? So, again, you can kill someone with a fist, stick, knife, or gun, as people say, but guns make it easier to deploy lethal force, right? There are cases where people have killed others with their fist, right? You can beat someone to death, you can knife them to death, right? But if you want to make this as easy as possible, right, I think the gun is the best choice. Again, this is why, you don't bring a knife to a gunfight, right? You don't bring your fist to a gunfight. Um, so people without guns injure people, whereas people with guns tend to kill people. This is firearm instrumentality. And if you have a larger caliber gun with a greater capacity, this makes homicide more likely, right? So in the days of the 5-shot 32 revolver, you could definitely kill some people, and I'll have something to say about that. But if you have a 17 round magazine in a pistol chambered for 9mm, right, that's going to just make the killing a lot easier. All right, non-fatal shootings are failed homicides, or also called almost homicides, right? So again, having more or more powerful rounds in the gun matters in terms of whether those things are aggravated assaults or homicides versus being homicides. Now, this raises the question about substitution. I can't really get into all of the technicalities of that, but this is something that scholars working in this area do try to control for, right? So if you don't have access to a firearm, but you have a very strong intent to kill somebody else, you'll just substitute a different weapon, right? This is sort of the same idea as substitution effects in terms of suicide, right? So if you take guns away from someone who is suicidal and they have a very strong intention to commit suicide, then they can substitute a different means for that. But again, the unique nature of firearms makes it so that substitution is only partial, right? So some of the people who would kill somebody else if they, had enough intention, or someone who had enough intention to take their lives, would substitute, but not everybody would engage in substitution. Now, so the question of intentionality, I think, is really interesting. Again, hard to establish, but this is a very interesting study that was published looking at data on assaults in Jersey City, New Jersey from 1992 to 1996, and looked at assault outcomes by firearms type. So this here on the left is what the assault outcomes look like for semi-automatic pistols, right? So of all of the people who threatened somebody else, 69% of those cases did they attack the other person, right? And 31% of the cases they didn't attack the other person, they only threatened them, right? Of those who engaged in attack, right, 58% injured the person they were attacking, and 42% of the cases the person being attacked wasn't injured. And in 16% of those cases in which the person was injured, the person was killed. And in 84% of the cases, the person lived. Okay, so that's the pattern for semi-automatic pistols. What's interesting is if you look at the pattern for revolvers, right? So again, very similar numbers, right? So certain number of people were threatened, 68% of people were attacked compared to 69% with the semi-auto, right? Among the people attacked, 56% were injured, very similar to the semi-automatic rate of injury. But look at the deaths. 25% of the people who were attacked by an assailant with a revolver died. And this is a higher proportion of death than the deaths of people who were attacking with a semi-automatic pistol, right? So intentionality does matter, right? Perhaps even skill matters. Maybe if you're a criminal and you're carrying a revolver, you're more skilled at using that revolver, right? Whatever the case may be, it's not as simple as just saying semi-automatic pistols are more lethal than revolvers, right? Now, this doesn't talk in any detail about the type of semi-automatic pistol, the type of revolver, but on its face, this does sort of pump the brakes some on the question of intentionality, and makes us realize that, what the person is trying to accomplish matters alongside at least what type of weapon they have while they're doing their business. This also came up in an interesting piece that was published about the city of Chicago back in 2018, and they were looking at changes in homicide deaths from 1992 and into 2016, not over that period, but in 1992 and in 2016. And they were trying to figure out, this issue of instrumentality, right? Were guns becoming more lethal over this period of time? Because you can imagine 1992, what types of guns would be common on the streets of Chicago, and in 2016, the types. But so in 1992, homicide victims were hit an average of 2.5 times. By 2016, homicide victims were hit an average of 4.2 times. So the number of shots being taken by homicide victims had increased almost by 200%, almost doubled over that period of time. Right. Also in 1992, 3 gunshot victims had been hit 10 or more times. And by 2016, 7 victims had been hit 10 or more times. So again, a doubling of that. So this, to, I think, the authors, the researchers, was indicative of the fact that people in 2016 are carrying more high capacity pistols than they were in 1992. So people are getting hit more often because of that increased capacity. But again, on the intentionality side, right? So moving from instrumentality to intentionality, of those killed by a single bullet, a larger percentage in 1992 than in 2016 suffered a wound to the body rather than the head, right? So some people were killed with a single shot. In 1992, those people were more likely to be shot in the body, whereas in 2016, they're more likely to be shot in the head. And I'm thinking, if people are being shot in the head, that is a strong intention to kill somebody, right? You don't shoot someone in the head unless you're intending to kill someone. Okay. In 1992, 5% of homicide victims were killed sitting in a vehicle. In 2016, 20% were killed sitting in a vehicle. So a 400% increase in the number or the proportion of victims who were killed sitting in their cars. So again, to me, this speaks to intentionality, right? It's much more a situation basically of kind of assassination. Again, and if you're seeing this pattern, it really speaks, I think, much more to intentionality than instrumentality, right? Because, if I intend to shoot someone, to kill someone, and, shoot them in their head or shoot them when they're in their car, I can be using, low capacity magazine. I could be using a revolver, whatever the case may be. So, again, I do, think that if I have 17 rounds of 9mm in a semi-auto, that, maybe I'm better off than if I have, 5 rounds of 22. But I can certainly do a lot of damage with 5 rounds of 22 if I wanted to. The other question that I really, can't get into here very much, but is something that I hope all of you, think about, and maybe in conversation someday you can instruct me about, or we can reflect about this together, is this idea that guns don't kill people, right? The finger pulls the trigger and shooter intentionality matters. And you might recognize this picture of a rifle that was found after something like 130 years sitting in Great Basin National Park in Nevada. That gun never shot anybody on its own. It just sat there for 130 years, right? But what if guns change our intentionality, not when they're sitting away from us, but when we're actually using guns? Can guns actually have a coercive power over us, right? This is a logic that has been put forward by some people, right, under the rubric that people with guns kill people. And it's not that the finger pulls the trigger, but there are certain senses in which the trigger pulls the finger, right? The gun compels us to use it when it's in our possession, right? It changes our intentionality. So philosopher Don Ida says the human gun relation transforms the situation from any similar situation of a human without a gun, right? A human with a gun is not just human plus gun. It has a kind of fundamental uh, ability to alter the situation. And the philosopher, he's actually a sociologist of science, Bruno Latour, says you are different with a gun in your hand, and the gun is different with you holding it, right? So there's an interaction that takes place between humans and technology, right? And if you think about, the way that we interact with lots of different technologies, right? We are different with a cell phone, a smartphone in our hand, uh, and the smartphone is different because we're holding it, right? So a smartphone that's sitting on our desk is different than a smartphone in our hand. I think this is somewhat provocative. I do think that human beings interact with technologies. I don't think that it makes us basically victim to the firearms or not having any control over the firearms. So we may actually do things or think things, feel things, when we have a firearm in our hand that we don't or wouldn't if we don't have a firearm in the hand. And there's lots of people wearing orange jumpsuits, who are wearing orange jumpsuits because they interacted with a firearm relative to other people in ways that they might not have otherwise.